Fluorescent hospital lights buzzed like dying hornets above her. Nora clutched the edge of the plastic waiting room chair, a fractured rib screaming with every shallow breath. Her fiancé had dumped her at the curb of St. Jude's Emergency 2 hours ago, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a target on her head. She had no money, no safe harbor, just a single 10-digit number burned into her memory, a number belonging to a man who promised her ruin. She picked up the receiver, dialed. He answered. The triage nurse did not look up from her monitor. Her name tag read Brenda, and she had the exhausted, glassy-eyed stare of a woman who had seen 3 gunshot wounds and a severe stabbing before her lunch break. No insurance card, no state ID, Brenda stated, her voice flat. She typed something into the keyboard, the clacking loud in the stagnant air of the emergency room. I can patch the laceration on your brow, honey, but if you want a doctor to look at that rib, I need a billing address or a deposit. Hospital policy. Nora sat across the counter, her left arm clamped tightly against her torso. Every inhalation felt like swallowing broken glass. Her jeans were soaked with rainwater and street grime. Her oversized grey sweater, which belonged to Dean, was stained with a rusty, dark patch near the hem. It wasn't her blood. It belonged to the man who had hit her, right before Dean had shoved him backward into a glass coffee table. That was 3 hours ago. 3 hours since the illusion of Nora's perfectly ordinary, painfully normal life had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "I don't have my purse," Nora said. Her voice sounded thin, hollow. It didn't sound like the voice of a 30-year-old woman who managed a boutique bakery in the suburbs. It sounded like a frightened kid. It was in the car. He drove off. Brenda stopped typing. She finally looked up, taking in the swelling purple bruise along Nora's cheekbone, the shivering frame, the sheer desperation radiating from her. A flicker of pity crossed the nurse's tired face, but it was quickly buried under the heavy weight of institutional bureaucracy. "Are you safe right now?" Brenda asked softly. "Do you want me to call the police?" "No." The word snapped out of Nora faster than she intended. She winced, fresh agony flaring in her side. "No police, please." Calling the police meant giving a statement. A statement meant going on the record about Dean's gambling debts. It meant dragging out the reality that the man she was supposed to marry in 3 months had borrowed $50,000 from men who did not send collection letters. Men who showed up at your apartment on a Tuesday night with brass knuckles and a calm, terrifying demeanor. Dean had promised her a safe life, a boring life. That was all she had ever wanted. A house with a lawn, a dog, a man who worked in software sales and worried about cholesterol. She had spent the last 4 years building a fortress of mundane stability to keep the shadows of her past out, and then the door had been kicked open. Dean had cowered in the hallway while a man with a scarred lip grabbed Nora by the hair, throwing her into the edge of the kitchen island to send a message. The crack of her rib had echoed in the small apartment. Dean had scrambled, panicked, thrown a heavy vase, and grabbed her. He dragged her down the fire escape, shoved her into his Honda Civic, and drove like a madman toward the city limits. He didn't speak the entire ride. He just sweated and shook. When they reached St. Jude's, he hadn't even put the car in park. He leaned over, popped the passenger door open and said, "I have to fix this. I'll come back for you. I swear, Nora. Hide!" Then he had pushed her out onto the wet pavement and peeled away into the rain. He wasn't coming back. Nora knew that with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had seen real monsters. Dean was a coward. He was already halfway to a different state, leaving her as collateral. "I can let you sit in the waiting area," Brenda said, breaking into her thoughts. But without an ID or payment, I can't admit you for the X-ray. I'm sorry. If it gets worse, or you have trouble breathing, yell. Can I use your phone? Nora asked, staring at the black landline sitting next to Brenda's keyboard. My cell was in my purse. Brenda hesitated, then pushed the phone across the counter. Make it quick. Line 9 for an outside call. Nora reached for the receiver with trembling fingers. She pulled it to her ear, listening to the dial tone. She stared at the keypad. For 4 years, she had deliberately forgotten everything about her old life. She had deleted contacts, changed her number, moved cities. She had scrubbed her existence clean. But there was one number she couldn't erase. It was etched into the dark, quiet corners of her mind. A fail-safe she had sworn on her life she would never use. Calling this number meant admitting defeat. It meant stepping willingly back into the cold, violent world she had nearly died trying to escape. She looked over her shoulder. The ER waiting room was sparsely populated. A homeless man sleeping in the corner, a mother rocking a feverish toddler, and standing near the vending machines, a man in a damp leather jacket. He wasn't buying anything. He was just watching the entrance. He looked familiar. He looked like the driver of the black SUV that had parked outside her apartment building yesterday. Dean's debt collectors hadn't let her go. They were tracking her, making sure she didn't talk to the cops, waiting for her to leave the hospital. Panic, sharp and cold, flooded her veins. Normal was dead. Normal was a luxury she could no longer afford. Nora pressed line 9. She punched in the 10 digits. Her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped the plastic receiver. The phone began to ring. 1 ring. 2. She held her breath, praying it was disconnected. Praying a stranger would answer. On the 3rd ring, the line clicked open. There was no greeting, just the heavy, absolute silence of someone listening. Nora swallowed hard. Henry? The silence stretched for a full 3 seconds. Then, a voice that sounded like gravel and dark silk answered. You have 3 seconds to tell me who's bleeding, Nora, or I'm hanging up. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Henry Gallo's penthouse office, obscuring the glittering skyline of the city below. The room was dark, save for the ambient glow of the streetlights bleeding through the glass and the low burn of a single desk lamp. Henry sat behind a massive slab of reclaimed walnut, a ledger open in front of him, a tumbler of Lagavulin resting near his right hand. He wore a charcoal suit, the jacket discarded over the back of his chair, the sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink winding up his forearms. He was 34 years old, and he owned the southern docks, 3 local judges, and a network of influence that stretched from the concrete shipping yards to the marbled halls of the state capitol. He was a man who traded in leverage, fear, and absolute control. At exactly midnight, the silence of his office was fractured by a sharp, electronic trill. Henry's pen stopped moving. He didn't look up immediately. He just stared at the ledger, his jaw tightening. The sound was coming from the bottom left drawer of his desk, a drawer that held a loaded Glock 19, a stack of bearer bonds, and a cheap, prepaid burner phone that had not rang in 48 months. It rang again. Harsh, demanding. In the shadows near the office door, Matteo shifted. Henry's head of security and oldest friend didn't speak, but his posture straightened. Matteo knew exactly what that phone was. He knew who it belonged to. Henry set his pen down. He opened the drawer. The small screen glowed in the darkness. Unknown caller. 4 years ago, Nora had stood in the foyer of his estate, clutching a cardboard box of her belongings. She had looked at him with eyes full of exhaustion and terror. "I can't do this, Dom," she had said, her voice shaking but resolute. I can't sleep waiting for the sound of sirens. I can't wash another man's blood out of your shirts. I want to be safe. I just want a normal life." He had let her go. He hadn't fought her. Henry Gallo did not beg. He had told her that the world was a meat grinder, and that her idea of a safe, normal life was a fairy tale sold to sheep. But he had given her a number. "When the wolves come anyway," he had told her, "call me." He picked up the phone and pressed the green button. He didn't say a word. He listened. He heard the ambient noise of a large room, the faint murmur of a PA system, and the jagged, uneven breathing of a woman in pain. "Henry." Her voice hit him like a physical blow to the chest. It was thinner than he remembered. Frail, stripped of the fiery defiance that used to drive him out of his mind. He kept his tone flat, emotionless. "You have 3 seconds to tell me who's bleeding, Nora, or I'm hanging up." "Me," she whispered. The air in the office instantly plummeted 10 degrees. Henry stood up. He didn't rush, but the sudden, coiled tension in his frame made Matteo step forward, his hand dropping instinctually to his waistband. "Where are you?" Henry asked, grabbing his suit jacket. "St. Jude's Emergency, the waiting room." Her breath hitched, a stifled sob or a gasp of pain. He couldn't tell. I don't have anywhere else to go. I think they're watching me." "Who?" "I don't know. Dean's people. The men he owes money to. There's a guy by the vending machines." Henry paused. Dean, the fiancé, the aggressively mediocre software salesman his private investigators had run background checks on 3 years ago. Henry had read the file. Dean was a civilian, boring, weak, completely harmless. Or so Henry had thought. The idea that this civilian had dragged Nora into something that ended with her bleeding in a public hospital ignited a cold, calculated fury in the pit of his stomach. "Are you dying, Nora?" "No, my rib is broken. Maybe a concussion. It hurts to breathe." "Sit in the most visible chair in the room. Put your back to a wall. Do not look at the man by the machines. Do not speak to the police." Henry slid his arms into his suit jacket, adjusting the lapels with lethal precision. "I'm 10 minutes away. If anyone approaches you before I get there, scream." He ended the call before she could reply. He tossed the burner onto the desk and looked at Matteo. "Bring the car around. We're going to St. Jude's." Matteo's dark eyes narrowed slightly. "Nora?" "Yes." "How many guys?" She saw one. Assume there are 3. Mid-level debt collectors, judging by the mess they've made. Henry walked past Matteo, his stride long and purposeful. "No noise, Matteo. It's a hospital. We clean this up quiet." "And the fiancé?" Matteo asked, following him into the private elevator. The steel doors slid shut, sealing them in the polished wood and mirrored cabin. Henry watched the floor numbers descend. His reflection stared back at him, hard, unreadable, violently calm. "If he's there," Henry said softly, "he won't be leaving." The ride down to the underground garage took exactly 30 seconds. The armored Mercedes S-Class was waiting, engine purring. Henry got into the back seat. Matteo slid behind the wheel, throwing the heavy sedan into gear. They shot out into the driving rain, tires hissing violently against the slick asphalt. Henry stared out the window at the blurred city lights. She had left him for peace. She had abandoned the empire he was building to play house with a man who couldn't even protect her from low-level street trash. A bitter, cynical satisfaction curled in the back of his mind, but it was entirely overshadowed by the sheer, overwhelming urge to burn the city to the ground for touching what belonged to him. Because despite the 4 years, despite the miles and the silence, Nora had always belonged to him. The fairy tale was over. She had dialed his number. She was back in the dark. The automatic doors of St. Jude's ER slid open with a mechanical hiss, letting in a gust of freezing wind and the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the storm outside. Henry stepped onto the linoleum floor. Matteo was a half-step behind him, a shadow in a tailored trench coat. The waiting room was a depressing tableau of human misery. The air smelled of industrial bleach, wet wool, and stale coffee. It took Henry 2 seconds to assess the room. He clocked the exits, the cameras, the tired triage nurse behind the plexiglass. Then his eyes found her. Nora was sitting in a plastic chair bolted to the far wall. She was huddled into herself, a wet, grey sweater hanging off her shoulders, her dark hair plastered to her skull. Her face was pale, save for an ugly, blooming contusion on her left cheek. She looked small, defeated. Something feral and violent snapped against its chains in Henry's chest, but his face remained a mask of polite indifference. Before he moved toward her, his gaze swept the room again. By the vending machines, a man in a cheap leather jacket was pretending to read a pamphlet. Near the restrooms, another man, thick-necked and wearing a wet hoodie, was leaning against the wall, chewing a toothpick. Matteo saw them too. A brief look passed between the boss and his enforcer. Matteo nodded once, peeling off toward the restrooms. Henry walked straight toward the man at the vending machines. His footsteps were silent on the tile. The man in the leather jacket didn't notice Henry until he was a foot away, entering his personal space. The man looked up, startled, puffing his chest slightly. "Hey, buddy, back off! I'm waiting for—" Henry didn't break stride. He didn't raise his hands. He simply leaned in close, his voice dropping to a smooth, conversational whisper that didn't carry past the man's ear. "You work for the Tolliver crew, don't you?" Henry asked, recognizing the cheap street tattoos on the man's neck. The man blinked, his bravado faltering. "Who's asking?" "My name is Henry Gallo." The man's face went slack. The blood drained from his cheeks so fast he looked jaundiced. Everyone in the city's underbelly knew the name Gallo. It was synonymous with people disappearing into the harbor. Mr. Gallo, I didn't—" "The girl in the grey sweater," Henry interrupted, his voice still a pleasant, terrifying hum. "You're here for her? To collect on Dean's debt?" "We're just keeping an eye out, making sure she don't talk to no badges," the man stammered, taking a step back until his shoulders hit the glass of the soda machine. "Her debt is cleared," Henry said softly. "You're going to walk out those front doors. You're going to get in your car, and you are going to tell your boss that Nora Hayes is under my protection. If anyone from your crew looks at her again, I won't just kill you. I will dismantle your entire operation, piece by piece, and I will feed your boss his own teeth. Do you understand me?" The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked past Henry, toward the restrooms. Matteo was standing there, gripping the second thug by the back of his hoodie, the barrel of a suppressed pistol pressed discreetly into the man's ribs under the folds of Matteo's coat. "Yes, sir," the man whispered. "Get out." Henry didn't watch them leave. He turned his back on them and walked across the waiting room. Nora looked up as he approached. Her eyes, normally a bright, piercing amber, were dull and clouded with pain. She looked at his expensive suit, his polished shoes, and then up to his face. He hadn't changed. He was still the immovable object he had always been, a towering monument of controlled violence. Henry crouched in front of her chair, keeping a respectable distance so he wouldn't crowd her. "Nora," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of the ice he had used on the thug. "You came," she rasped, her voice cracking. "I told you I would." He reached out, his large, warm hand gently cupping the unbruised side of her face. His thumb brushed over her jawline. Her skin was freezing. "Can you walk?" "I think so. It's my rib. It's sharp. Where is he, Nora? Where is Dean?" She closed her eyes, a tear finally escaping and sliding down her cheek. The shame in her expression was profound. She had left an emperor for a peasant, and the peasant had thrown her to the wolves. He left. He dumped me at the door and drove it away. He owed them money. Henry felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He wanted to track Dean down tonight and skin him alive, but that was secondary. Right now, the hospital lights were too bright, and Nora was shivering. "He's handled. The men watching you are gone," Henry said, standing up. He slipped out of his wool suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The heavy, expensive fabric engulfed her. It smelled of cedar, cold rain, and expensive tobacco. It smelled like safety. "We're leaving." "The nurse," Nora protested weakly, clutching the lapels of his jacket. "She said I need an X-ray. I need a doctor. I have a private surgeon waiting at my house. He won't ask for an ID, and he doesn't fill out police reports." Henry leaned down, wrapping one arm carefully behind her back, avoiding the injured ribs, and sliding his other arm under her knees. "Henry, wait, I can walk." "I'm not watching you limp out of here, Nora." With effortless strength, he lifted her into his arms. The sudden movement made her gasp in pain, but she instinctively buried her face into his neck, her cold fingers twisting into his dress shirt. As Henry carried her past the triage desk, Brenda the nurse stood up, her eyes wide with alarm. "Excuse me, sir. She hasn't been discharged. You can't just take her." Henry paused. He looked at the tired nurse, his dark eyes entirely devoid of warmth. "She was never here." He didn't wait for a response. He carried Nora through the sliding automatic doors and out into the torrential rain. Matteo was already holding the rear door of the Mercedes open, as Henry slid her onto the plush leather seats and climbed in beside her. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the howl of the storm. The interior of the car was warm and silent. Nora leaned her head back against the leather, the agonizing pain in her side dulling just a fraction beneath the overwhelming realization of what she had done. She looked at Henry, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the quiet luxury of the car. Henry poured a neat glass of scotch from the crystal decanter in the center console and handed it to her. "Drink. It helps with the shock." "Henry, I'm sorry I called. I didn't have a choice." He took the glass from her shaking hands and held it to her lips himself, waiting until she swallowed the burning amber liquid. "You always had a choice, Nora," Henry said, his voice a dark, velvet promise in the dim light. "You chose to leave. And tonight, you chose to come back. Don't expect me to let you go a second time." The tires of the Mercedes crunched over the crushed gravel of the long, winding driveway. Outside the tinted windows, the storm raged. But inside the car, the silence was absolute. The heavy iron gates of Henry's estate had parted silently at their approach, sealing shut the moment the rear bumper cleared the threshold. Nora stared blankly at the wet, manicured lawns illuminated by cold security lights. She recognized the grounds. She recognized the imposing, brutalist architecture of the main house: concrete, glass, and dark steel. It was a fortress built to look like a modern architectural marvel. 4 years ago, she had walked down this exact driveway with a single suitcase, refusing to let Henry's driver take her to the train station. She had wanted to feel every step of her departure. Now she was being carried back over the threshold. Matteo parked under the massive portico. Before the engine even cut out, the heavy oak front door swung open. A man with silver hair and a worn leather medical bag stood in the foyer. Dr. Shaw. He had patched up Henry's men for a decade, operating in the grey space between the Hippocratic Oath and criminal complicity. Henry didn't wait for Matteo to open his door. He kicked it open himself, sliding out into the damp air and pulling Nora with him. The pain in her side flared sharply, stealing her breath. She gripped his lapels, burying her face against his collarbone. He smelled of rain and gunpowder. It was a terrifyingly familiar scent. "Directly to the West Wing guest room," Henry said to the doctor as he carried her inside. He didn't take her to the master suite. He didn't take her to the room she had once occupied. He carried her down a long, immaculate hallway, lined with contemporary art she didn't recognize. The house felt colder than she remembered. Emptier. Henry set her down on the edge of a wide, low-profile bed. The mattress was firm. The sheets were slate grey. He stepped back immediately, giving Dr. Shaw room to work. "Let's take a look, Miss Hayes," Shaw said, his voice quiet and professional. The next 20 minutes were an exercise in grounded, miserable reality. There was no gentle romance in the medical exam. Shaw used medical shears to cut the ruined, blood-stained sweater off her body. Nora shivered in her bra as the cold air of the room hit her bruised skin. Henry didn't look away. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the doctor probe the swelling along her ribcage. His expression was a blank wall, but his eyes tracked every wince, every sharp intake of breath she made. 2 fractured ribs, the 7th and 8th, Shaw muttered, pressing 2 cold fingers against the deep purple mottling on her side. "No flail chest. Lungs sound clear, so we avoid a punctured pleura. You're lucky." "I don't feel lucky," Nora rasped. Shaw offered a grim, polite smile. He cleaned the cut on her brow with antiseptic that stung like a wasp's sting, sealing it with surgical glue rather than stitches to minimize scarring. He bound her ribs with tight, elastic compression tape. With every wrap, the agonizing stabbing in her side dulled to a heavy, suffocating ache. "Keep the binding dry," Shaw instructed, packing his instruments away. "I'll leave hydrocodone for the pain. Take 2 tonight, 1 every 6 hours tomorrow. You'll have trouble taking deep breaths, but I need you to try, otherwise you risk pneumonia." "Thank you, Doctor," Henry said from the shadows near the window. It was a dismissal. Shaw nodded, picking up his bag. "I'll check on her tomorrow evening, Mr. Gallo. Good night." The heavy bedroom door clicked shut. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nora sat on the edge of the bed, her arms crossed over her stomach. She felt incredibly exposed, half naked and painted in bruises. 4 years ago, she had known every nuance of the man standing across the room. Now, he felt like a stranger. A very dangerous stranger. Henry walked to the closet and pulled out a heavy, dark grey cashmere robe. He walked over and held it out. Nora slipped her arms into the sleeves, pulling it tight across her chest. The fabric was incredibly soft, trapping her body heat. "Thank you. Do you want water? Food?" His tone was conversational, polite. It terrified her. "No, just sleep. Take the pills, Nora." He pointed to the small amber bottle Shaw had left on the nightstand. She picked them up, dry swallowing 2 tablets. She winced as they went down. Henry stood over her for a long moment. He looked at the stark contrast of her pale, bruised face against the dark cashmere. He reached out, his knuckles brushing against her uninjured cheek. His touch was feather-light, entirely at odds with the violence she knew he was capable of. "Sleep," he commanded softly. "No one gets through those gates. You are completely safe here." He turned and walked toward the door. "Henry!" she called out. Her voice was weak, betraying the exhaustion settling into her bones. He stopped, hand on the brass doorknob. He didn't look back. "Why did you answer?" she asked. "After 4 years. After everything I said to you when I left. You could have let it ring." Henry looked at the wood of the door. The muscles in his broad back shifted under his tailored shirt. "Because for 4 years, I've been waiting for it to ring. Good night, Nora." The door closed. Nora was alone in the quiet dark, the weight of his words pressing down on her heavier than the tape around her ribs. Nora woke to the sound of rain lashing against the glass. The storm hadn't broken. The bedroom was bathed in the flat, grey light of mid-morning. She tried to sit up, and a sharp, breathtaking spike of pain radiated from her side. The painkillers had worn off. She gritted her teeth, moving with agonizing slowness, rolling onto her uninjured side and pushing herself upright. The cashmere robe was tangled around her legs. She shuffled into the ensuite bathroom. The woman staring back at her in the mirror looked wrecked. Her left eye was swollen shut, a vibrant canvas of violet and yellow. The surgical glue on her eyebrow held a jagged red line together. She looked like a casualty of war. In a way, she was. She washed her face with a warm washcloth, avoiding the bruises, and took another pain pill. Someone had left a stack of clothes on the bathroom counter, a pair of soft black leggings, and an oversized, thick cotton t-shirt. They were brand new. The tags had been removed. She dressed slowly, her breath hitching with every bend and reach. She stepped out of the guest room and into the silent hallway. The estate felt like a tomb. There were no sounds of life, no television, no clattering dishes, no dogs barking. Just the hum of the central heating and the rain. She found Henry in his study at the end of the east wing. The doors were wide open. He was sitting behind a massive desk, staring at a laptop screen. He wore a black Henley that stretched tight across his chest and shoulders, the sleeves pushed up to reveal the heavy, dark tattoos creeping up his forearms. A cup of black coffee steamed at his elbow. He didn't look up as she hovered in the doorway. "Sit down before you fall down, Nora." She walked in and sank into one of the leather armchairs opposite his desk. The leather groaned softly. "How are the ribs?" he asked, finally closing the laptop. His dark eyes locked onto hers. They were sharp, analytical, missing nothing. "They hurt," she said honestly. "They will for a month." Henry picked up a thick manila folder from his desk and tossed it casually toward her. It landed with a heavy thud. "Eat." She looked at the small side table next to her chair. A tray had been set there, holding a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and a glass of orange juice. She wasn't hungry, but the sheer force of Henry's will in the room made her pick up a piece of toast. "What's in the folder?" she asked, chewing slowly. "The reality of your boring, safe life," Henry replied. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I made some calls last night while you were bleeding on my guest bed. I pulled the thread on Dean." Nora stopped chewing. The mention of Dean brought a fresh wave of humiliation. "I didn't know about the gambling, Henry. He hid it well. We shared a bank account, but he had separate credit cards. It wasn't just gambling, Nora." Henry's voice was devoid of pity. It was surgical. "Dean didn't just rack up a 50 grand debt at an underground poker table. He tried to play commodities broker with money that belonged to Marcus Tolliver. He promised a 20% return on a high-risk venture using Tolliver's front money. When the market dipped, your fiancé panicked. He tried to cover the losses by borrowing from a loan shark in the South End, a shark who happens to kick back to me." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. The toast in her mouth turned to ash. "He took Mafia money to pay back a cartel front." "He took money from wolves to pay off jackals," Henry corrected, his gaze unrelenting. And when both sides came collecting, he realized he didn't have the cash, so he packed a bag. He told me he was going to fix it. The word sounded pathetic, even to her own ears. He pushed you out of a moving car at a hospital to buy himself a head start, Henry said flatly. The men in your apartment weren't there to break your ribs, Nora. They were there to take you. Tolliver deals in human collateral. If Dean couldn't pay, they were going to put you on a boat out of the port of Miami to work off his debt. You wouldn't have survived the week. Nora's stomach pitched violently. She put the toast down. Her hands were shaking. She had spent 4 years baking sourdough bread. She had worried about health inspector scores and whether the buttercream on her cupcakes was too sweet. She had built a life so aggressively mundane that it felt like an armor against the darkness she had left behind. And Dean had invited the darkness right into her living room. I didn't know, she whispered, staring at the floor. I swear to God, Dom. I thought he was just normal. I thought he was safe. Henry stood up. He walked around the desk, his presence filling the large room. He stopped in front of her chair, looking down at her bowed head. Normal is a lie they sell to people who are too afraid to look at how the world actually works, Henry said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant rumble. There is no safe, Nora. There is only power, and there is leverage. I tried to tell you that 4 years ago. You didn't want to listen. You wanted a man who wore khakis and came home at 5, and he traded your life to save his own skin. Nora squeezed her eyes shut. Tears pricked the corners, born of anger and profound betrayal. You don't have to rub it in. I know I made a mistake. I'm not rubbing it in. Henry crouched down, forcing her to look at him. His face was inches from hers. There was a raw, simmering intensity in his eyes that he rarely let surface. I am making sure you understand that the illusion is dead. You don't get to go back to the bakery. You don't get to go back to the apartment. Tolliver knows who you are. The South End crew knows who you are. You belong to the game again. I don't want to be in the game, she choked out. It doesn't matter what you want, Henry said softly, his thumb brushing away a stray tear on her unbruised cheek. You called me. You invoked my name in that hospital. The street knows you are under my roof. If you walk out those gates, you are dead. Nora stared at him, her heart hammering against her taped ribs. He wasn't threatening her. He was stating a geographical fact. The cage door had locked the moment the Mercedes drove onto the estate. Before she could respond, a heavy knock echoed through the study. Henry stood up, his face instantly clearing of all emotion, reverting to stone. Come in. Matteo opened the door. He was wearing a dark suit, his trench coat damp from the rain. He didn't look at Nora. He looked directly at Henry. We found the car, Matteo said, his voice gravelly. He didn't get far. The heavy silence in the study seemed to thicken. Nora's pulse hammered a dull, frantic rhythm against her fractured ribs. Where? Henry asked. He didn't move, but the air around him shifted. The calm, calculating businessman vanished, replaced by the apex predator that governed the city's underworld. A Motel 6 off Interstate 95, 3 towns over, Matteo reported. He used a credit card to pay for a tank of gas at a Sunoco 2 miles from the motel. Sloppy. Our guy inside the credit bureau flagged it 10 minutes ago. We have a team watching the room. Is he alone? Looks like it. Pacing. Looking out the blinds every 5 minutes. The Civic is parked around back. Matteo paused, finally glancing at Nora before looking back to his boss. Tolliver's guys are actively looking for him, Dom. They've hit 2 of his known associates this morning. It's only a matter of time before they find the motel. Henry checked the heavy Rolex on his left wrist. They won't. I'm leaving now. Have the car out front. Matteo nodded and slipped back out the door, pulling it shut behind him. Henry walked to his desk. He opened a bottom drawer and pulled out a matte black Sig Sauer. He checked the magazine with a sharp, metallic click, slammed it back into the grip, and slid the weapon into the holster at the small of his back. He grabbed a dark suit jacket from the back of his chair. Nora watched him, her breath caught in her throat. The casual violence of his routine was jarring. "What are you going to do to him?" she asked. Her voice shook, slicing through the quiet room. Henry paused, shrugging into his jacket. He looked at her, his expression entirely unreadable. "I'm going to handle a liability." "Henry, don't!" Nora stood up. The sudden movement sent a spike of white-hot agony through her side. She gasped, grabbing the arm of the chair for support. Henry was across the room in a second. He grabbed her elbows, steadying her, his grip firm but careful. "Sit down. You're going to tear the cartilage." She refused to sit. She forced herself to stand tall, looking him directly in the eye. "Don't kill him, please." Henry's jaw tightened. A muscle leaped beneath his cheekbone. "He broke your ribs. He left you to be trafficked by a cartel runner. And you are begging for his life?" "I'm not begging for his life," Nora spat, her own anger finally breaking through the shock. "I don't care what happens to him. I care what happens to me. If you kill him, I have to live with that. I have to live knowing my mistake cost someone their life. I don't want his blood on my ledger, Dom. I've spent 4 years trying to wash all the blood off." "It doesn't wash off," Henry said quietly. His hands were still on her arms, his heat radiating through her thin shirt. "It just dries. You know that, Nora. Just take the money back. Pay Tolliver. Let Dean run. He's a coward, but he'll keep running until he hits the ocean. Just let him go." Henry looked down at her. He studied her bruised, battered face. He saw the desperate clinging to her morality, the civilian ethics she still wrapped around herself like a shield. She didn't understand the mechanics of the machine she had fallen back into. "You think this is a movie," Henry said, his voice a harsh whisper. "You think I can just pay his debts and everyone shakes hands?" Tolliver lost face. Dean stole from him and ran. If I step in and pay Dean's debt, it looks like I'm sanctioning the theft. It looks like the Gallo family is protecting rats. That shows weakness. And in my world, weakness is an invitation for a war. Nora swallowed hard. "Then what happens? You don't negotiate with cancer, Nora. You cut it out." Henry let go of her arms. He took a step back, severing the physical connection. The sudden absence of his warmth made her shiver. "Henry." Dean made his choices. Henry walked toward the door. His voice was cold, professional, and final. "He chose to steal. He chose to run. He chose to throw you to the wolves. He doesn't get a pass because you feel guilty about picking a loser." He opened the heavy oak door. "Stay in the house," Henry ordered, not looking back. Matteo left 2 guards in the kitchen. "Do not open the doors. Do not answer the phones." "Are you coming back?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Henry stopped in the doorway. He looked over his shoulder. The dim light of the hallway cast half his face in deep shadow. "I always come back, Nora. That's the difference between me and him." He stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him. The lock clicked with a heavy, definitive thud. Nora stood alone in the study. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the glass, relentless and cold. She walked slowly over to the window, clutching her ribs. Minutes later, she watched the black Mercedes tear down the long driveway, its taillights bleeding into the grey storm, heading straight into the violence she had sacrificed everything to escape. The Motel 6 sat off a decaying stretch of Interstate 95, a concrete block of cheap desperation surrounded by a cracked asphalt parking lot. The neon sign buzzed. Half the letters burned out. Room 114 was at the back, facing a chain-link fence and a dense line of wet, skeletal pines. The lock on the cheap veneer door didn't require a kick. Matteo bypassed it with a quiet snap of a tension wrench. The door swung open, hitting the rubber stopper with a dull thud. Inside, the room smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpet, and fear. Dean was aggressively stuffing wrinkled dress shirts into a canvas duffel bag on the edge of the sagging mattress. He wore the same khakis and polo shirt from yesterday, though they were now violently wrinkled and stained with sweat. He froze, a fistful of fabric in his hands, as the door opened. Henry stepped into the room. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have to. The sheer, suffocating weight of his presence sucked the oxygen out of the small space. Matteo stepped in behind him, gently pushing the door shut. The lock clicked. It was the loudest sound in the world. Dean dropped the shirts. His face lost all color, turning a waxy, translucent gray. He took a staggering step backward until the back of his knees hit the cheap bedside table. The plastic ice bucket rattled. "Mr. Gallo," Dean breathed. His voice was a pathetic, reedy squeak. "I can explain. I have a plan. I just need 48 hours. Henry walked slowly toward the center of the room. He paused to look at a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon on the dresser. He picked it up, inspected the label with mild disgust, and set it back down. "You don't have 48 seconds, Dean," Henry said. His voice was a calm, level baritone. It wasn't the voice of a killer. It was the voice of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt ledger. "I have the money," Dean lied, his eyes darting frantically between Henry and Matteo. He held his hands up, palms out, a universal gesture of surrender. "I swear to God, I have a buddy in tech. He's wiring me the funds. I was going to pay Tolliver. I was going to fix it. Tolliver isn't your problem anymore," Henry said. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and slid his hands into his trouser pockets. "You made a mess in my city. You borrowed money from a crew that kicks back to my family, and then you stole from a man who doesn't tolerate disrespect. But I don't care about the money. The 50 grand is pocket change." Dean swallowed audibly. He looked like he was going to vomit. "Then what? What do you want?" "Take the car. Take whatever I have." "I want to know the exact timeline," Henry said, his dark eyes locking onto Dean's terrified face. "I want to know exactly what you said to Tolliver's men before they showed up at the apartment." Dean balked. A fresh layer of sweat broke out on his forehead. "I didn't say anything. They just found us. They tracked my phone. I didn't know they were coming." Henry didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Matteo. Matteo stepped forward. In one fluid, brutal motion, he drove a heavy leather shoe squarely into Dean's left kneecap. The cartilage popped with a sickening crunch. Dean screamed, a high, ragged sound, and collapsed onto the stained carpet, clutching his leg. He writhed, hyperventilating, his face pressed into the cheap rug. "You're a software salesman, Dean. You sell data," Henry said, walking over and looking down at the writhing man. "You don't have the stomach for this life, so don't try to lie to someone who built it. Tolliver's men didn't kick your door in. The deadbolt wasn't broken. Nora's ribs were broken, but your door was perfectly intact. You let them in." Dean sobbed, clutching his shattered knee. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the dust of the carpet. "They were going to kill me," he choked out. "They had a gun to my head in the alley behind my office. They said they needed collateral until the money cleared." Henry tilted his head slightly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop below freezing. "Collateral. They knew about her." Dean wept, curling into a fetal position. They knew she was pretty. They said they could put her to work at the port. Just for a few months. Just until I got the cash. I didn't have a choice, man. They were going to blow my brains out. So you gave them the apartment key, Henry finished, his voice a hollow, deadened sound. I was going to come back for her, Dean screamed, trying to drag himself backward, away from the two men in tailored suits. I was going to get the money and buy her back. I love her. I love her, please. Henry stared at him. The disgust in his chest was so profound, it bordered on exhaustion. Nora had left him, a man who would have burned the eastern seaboard to ash before letting a stranger touch a hair on her head, for a coward who handed over his own apartment key to human traffickers to save his own miserable life. She had wanted normal. She had found a parasite. You don't know what love is, Henry said softly. He turned his back on Dean and walked toward the door. Mr. Gallo, please, please, I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Tell Nora I'm sorry. Tell her. Henry reached the door and grasped the handle. He didn't look back. Put him in the bathtub, Henry said to Matteo. I don't want a mess for the maids. Matteo reached into his jacket and pulled out a suppressed pistol. Yes, boss. Henry stepped out into the cold rain and pulled the door shut behind him. He walked toward the Mercedes. Halfway across the asphalt, he heard a single, muffled thud from inside room 114. It sounded like a heavy textbook being dropped on a carpeted floor. Henry got into the back seat of the car. He poured himself a measure of scotch, drank it neat, and waited for his enforcer to return. The civilian was gone. The ledger was clean. Now it was time to deal with the wolves. The rain had finally slowed to a heavy, miserable mist by the time the Mercedes pulled back into the estate. The security lights cast long, distorted shadows across the wet lawns. Henry walked through the front doors. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The guards at the kitchen threshold nodded to him as he passed. He walked straight to the library in the West Wing. Nora was sitting in a high-backed leather chair near the unlit fireplace. She was wearing the oversized t-shirt and leggings, her bare feet tucked underneath her. She looked small, bruised, and completely out of place against the backdrop of dark mahogany and first-edition books. She looked up as he entered. Her amber eyes immediately dropped to his hands, then to the cuffs of his white shirt, searching for blood. There was none. Henry Gallo didn't do the wet work himself anymore. He hadn't for a long time. He walked over to the antique globe that doubled as a liquor cabinet. He poured 2 fingers of Lagavulin into a crystal tumbler. He didn't offer her one. She was on painkillers. It's done, he said, taking a slow sip. He stood by the desk, leaving the width of the room between them. Nora flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of her shoulders, but he caught it. She closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She just took a shallow, ragged breath that clearly pulled painfully at her taped ribs. Did he say anything? She asked. Her voice was incredibly quiet. A hollow sound in the cavernous room. Henry looked at her. He debated for a fraction of a second, letting her keep the lie. Letting her believe Dean was just a terrified civilian who panicked and ran. It would be kinder. It would preserve a shred of her dignity. But Henry didn't deal in kindness. He dealt in reality. And Nora needed reality if she was going to survive the coming week. He begged, Henry said flatly. He bargained. And he told me the truth about how Tolliver's men got into your apartment. Nora opened her eyes. The confusion cut through her grief. They kicked the door in. No, they didn't, Henry corrected. He set his glass down on the desk. The sharp clink echoed off the wood paneling. They walked in, because Dean gave them the key. Nora stared at him. The silence stretched tight, humming like a high-tension wire. "That's a lie," she whispered. "I don't lie to you, Nora. I never have. That was our only rule." Henry walked slowly across the Persian rug, stopping a few feet from her chair. Dean owed $50,000. Tolliver's men cornered him. They told him they needed collateral. They told him they could put you to work at the shipping yards until the debt was paid. Nora's breath hitched. A visceral shudder racked her frame, her hands flying to her stomach as if she had been physically struck. No, he wouldn't. He gave them the key, Nora, Henry repeated, his voice dropping into a dark, unforgiving register. He wasn't fighting them in the apartment to protect you. He only panicked and grabbed you because you came home early, and things got messy, and he realized he was going to have to watch them take you. The reality of his cowardice became too much for him. So he ran. Nora pressed her hands over her mouth. The sheer, suffocating horror of it washed the last remnants of color from her face. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. She had shared a bed with him. She had cooked him dinner. She had planned a wedding with a man who traded her into modern slavery to cover a bad bet. She let out a choked, jagged sob. It wasn't a cry of mourning for Dean. It was a cry of absolute, soul-crushing humiliation. Henry closed the distance. He knelt in front of her chair, careless of his expensive suit trousers. He reached out and gripped her wrists, pulling her hands away from her face. Her skin was ice cold. "Look at me," he commanded. She shook her head, tears spilling hot and fast over her bruised cheek. "I'm so stupid. God, Henry, I'm so stupid. I just wanted to be safe." "Look at me," he repeated, his grip tightening just enough to ground her. She opened her eyes. They were wide, fractured, and brimming with a terrifying vulnerability. "You aren't stupid. You were hopeful." "That's a civilian luxury," Henry said, his voice shedding its coldness, shifting into a fierce, simmering intensity. "But the civilian is dead now. You understand me? That girl who bakes bread and worries about a mortgage doesn't exist anymore. The world just showed you its teeth. You can either let it eat you, or you can bite back." "I don't know how to bite back," she choked out, her fingers curling weakly into the fabric of his jacket. "I don't have anything." "You have me," Henry stated. It wasn't a comfort. It was an absolute truth, heavy and immovable as a mountain. "You have the full weight of this family. You have the men standing outside that door. You have the guns, the money, and the power. But you have to claim it, Nora. You have to stop hiding in the guest room in borrowed clothes." He let go of her wrists and reached up, his large, calloused hands cupping her face. His thumbs brushed the tears away from her skin. The proximity was electric. For 4 years he had been a ghost, haunting her quiet life. Now, he was the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. "I told you I'd never let you go a second time," he whispered, his dark eyes burning into hers. "Tolliver is coming. He lost his money. He lost his collateral. And he's going to find out Dean is dead. He will come looking for blood." Nora stopped crying. The mention of the cartel front, of the men who had planned to drag her to the docks, triggered something deep and feral inside her. The fear began to curdle into a cold, hard rage. "Will they come here?" she asked. "They aren't stupid enough to assault this compound, but they will hit my businesses. They will try to draw me out into the street." Henry didn't break eye contact. "I am going to war over you, Nora. Are you going to hide behind the couch, or are you going to stand next to me?" Nora looked at the man who had ordered an execution to protect her, the man who terrified the city but treated her fractured ribs like spun glass. The illusion of morality she had clung to for 4 years evaporated, leaving only the brutal, honest truth of survival. She leaned into his hands, the first voluntary movement toward him in almost half a decade. "I'm not hiding," she breathed. A dark, dangerous satisfaction flared in Henry's eyes. He leaned in, his lips brushing the unbruised corner of her mouth. A ghost of a kiss. A promise of violence. Good. By midnight, the atmosphere in the estate had shifted from a quiet sanctuary to a militarized bunker. The heavy mahogany table in the formal dining room was covered in architectural blueprints, shipping manifests, and a half-dozen encrypted laptops. 6 of Henry's top lieutenants, men with scarred knuckles and tailored suits, were gathered around the table. Matteo stood at Henry's right hand, a silent, imposing sentinel. Nora sat at the far end of the table. She had gone back to the guest room and stripped off the oversized t-shirt. She had walked into the master suite closet, a room she hadn't entered in 4 years, and found that Henry hadn't thrown anything away. Her clothes were exactly where she had left them. She wore a sleek, black turtleneck and dark, fitted trousers. She looked sharp. She looked like she belonged. The men in the room had given her brief, respectful nods when she entered, and then immediately went back to business. In this house, Henry's protection elevated her to untouchable status. Henry stood at the head of the table, leaning forward on his knuckles. "Tolliver operates out of the steel recycling plant on 4th Street, Henry said, his voice carrying the authority of a general addressing his vanguard. "He uses it to launder the cash from his dock operations. He has 30 men on the payroll. We have 60. But I don't want a street war. I want a surgical strike. We hit his wallet first." "We can burn the recycling plant," one of the lieutenants, a heavy-set man named Luca, suggested. "Make a statement." "No," Henry countered. "If we burn it, the fire department comes. The cops come. Tolliver gets to play the victim of arson for the insurance payout. We don't burn it. We take it." The burner phone sitting in the center of the blueprints buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound that silenced the room instantly. Every eye turned to the phone. Henry straightened up. He looked at Matteo, who nodded and stepped back. Henry reached out and pressed the speaker button. "Speak!" Henry commanded. "I hear you found my runaway," a voice crackled through the small speaker. It was thick with a southern drawl, arrogant and relaxed. "Tolliver. And I hear you took out the trash. I appreciate that, Henry, I really do. Saved me a bullet. But we have a discrepancy." "You have a discrepancy," Henry corrected smoothly. "I have a clean ledger. Dean owed me 50,000, Tolliver continued, the relaxed tone hardening. "He offered me the girl to clear the debt. Now you have the girl, and Dean is floating in a bathtub at a Motel 6. By my math, Gallo, you owe me 50 grand, or you owe me the girl, and I don't want the cash." Nora's blood ran cold. The sheer audacity of it, treating her like a piece of cargo on a balance sheet, made her hands curl into tight fists under the table. Henry didn't look at Nora. He kept his eyes locked on the phone. "You stepped into my city, Tolliver. You threatened a woman under my protection. You are breathing right now because I haven't decided how I want to end you." A low, grating laugh came over the speaker. "You're getting soft, Dom. Going to war over a civilian? She left you, remember? She thought she was too good for your blood money. Now you're going to put your whole operation on the line for a used stray?" Matteo's hand drifted toward his holster, an involuntary reaction to the disrespect. Henry remained perfectly still. "She isn't a stray. She's a Gallo, and as of this moment, you are a dead man walking. Keep your men off the streets, Tolliver, because if I see them, they belong to me." Big words, Let's see if you can back them up when I burn your south docks to the waterline." The line clicked dead. The silence in the dining room was deafening. The lieutenants looked at Henry, waiting for the order that would ignite the city. Henry picked up the burner phone. He crushed the cheap plastic casing in his hand, the screen spider-webbing with a sharp crack, and tossed it onto the blueprints. He looked down the table at his men. "Luca, pull the teams from the north side. Consolidate at the south docks. Shoot anyone who doesn't have a badge or a union card. Matteo, assemble a strike team. We hit the recycling plant at 3 a.m. The men nodded in unison, immediately grabbing their phones and stepping out of the room to make the calls. Within 30 seconds, the dining room was empty, save for Henry, Matteo, and Nora. Henry looked down the long expanse of the table at her. She was pale, the bruised side of her face stark against the black turtleneck, but she was sitting perfectly straight. She wasn't shaking. "Matteo," Henry said, not breaking eye contact with Nora. "Get her a piece, a SIG P3 or 6.5. Show her how to chamber it." Matteo raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He turned on his heel and headed toward the armory in the basement. Nora stood up. The pain in her ribs was a dull roar, but the adrenaline pulsing through her veins masked it. She walked down the length of the table until she was standing right in front of him. "I don't know how to shoot," she said quietly. "You'll learn," Henry replied, his hands resting on her waist, pulling her flush against him. "You wanted to know if I was coming back tonight, Nora. The answer is yes. But when I walk out that door, you need to be able to protect the house." She looked up into his face. The cold, ruthless Mafia boss had faded, leaving only the man who had torn his own world apart to keep her safe. She reached up, her fingers threading into his dark hair, and pulled him down. The kiss was desperate, bruising, and tasted of scotch and violence. It was an absolute surrender to the darkness she had run from. When he finally pulled away, his breathing was heavy. He rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," Henry whispered, his voice a lethal promise, "I am locking the gates, Nora, and I am never letting you out." "I know," she answered, her amber eyes burning with a new, dangerous light. "Give me the gun." If you felt that chill run down your spine when Henry crushed the phone, you know the war has officially begun. Nora is finally stepping into her power, but with Tolliver mobilizing his men and the South Docks under threat, the bloodshed is only going to escalate. Will Henry's surgical strike work, or is the Gallo family walking into a cartel trap? Hit that like button if you love this dark, gritty turn. Share the story with your fellow romance drama addicts and subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the explosive shootout in Part 10. Let me know in the comments, do you think Nora has what it takes to pull the trigger? See you in the next chapter.